Ever wondered what truly lurks in those ancient Appalachian valleys, far from the trails and the faint hum of civilization? What secrets the mountains keep in their misty embrace? Tonight, we're going to find out. If tales of the uncanny, the unexplained, and the sheer terror of the unknown draw you in, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below telling me if you've ever felt something watching you in the wilderness. Because after this, you might just think twice about your next hike. Samuel was a man of logic. A nature photographer by trade, he chased the perfect shot, the untouched landscape, the raw, unfiltered beauty of the wild. He'd heard the local legends about the Appalachian. Of course, the strange lights, the whispers of things that weren't quite human. He dismissed them as quaint folklore, charming superstitions that added to the mystique of the region. He'd laugh, adjusting his expensive camera lens, saying, "The only spirits out here are the ones you bring with you." He arrived late October, when the leaves were ablaze with fiery hues, but held a brittle promise of decay. His target, a remote valley deep within a lesser-known section of the Appalachians, rumored to hold a waterfall of unparalleled beauty, untouched by human foot. For decades, the kind of place that would make his portfolio sing. The first day was glorious. Crisp air, the scent of pine and damp earth, the crunch of fallen leaves under his sturdy hiking boots. Samuel moved with practiced ease, his heavy camera bag a familiar weight. He took a few test shots, the light dappling through the canopy, painting the forest floor in shifting patterns. He found an old, barely discernible trail, more of an animal track, really, and decided to follow it deeper. This was it, the raw wilderness he craved, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery oranges and bruised purples. Samuel felt the first prickle of unease. It wasn't the cold or the growing shadows. It was the silence. Not the comfortable silence of nature, filled with the hum of insects or the distant call of a bird. This was a dead silence, oppressive, heavy. You could almost hear it ringing in your ears. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. You're standing there with him, aren't you? The air growing colder, the trees closing in, each one seeming to lean a little closer, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. What's your first instinct? To shout, to pull out your phone? Samuel, ever the pragmatist, told himself it was just the change in atmospheric pressure, altitude affecting the wildlife, nothing more. He pushed on, determined to reach his spot before nightfall. But then, he started noticing things, small things, at first. A cairn of rocks, perfectly balanced, in a place where no human trail existed. Then another and another. Not marker cairns, but something ritualistic, each stone meticulously placed. And then the symbols, etched into the bark of ancient trees, faint but unmistakable. Geometric shapes, spirals that seemed to twist into themselves, lines that crossed and converged in ways that felt wrong, primitive, ancient. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at his resolve. He pulled out his GPS, but the screen flickered, then died. His phone, which he'd ensured was fully charged, was now a useless brick in his pocket. No signal, of course, but the battery drain, unexplained. Darkness fell swiftly, a blanket of impenetrable blackness that swallowed the last vestiges of twilight. Samuel was lost, utterly, terrifyingly lost. He fumbled for his powerful headlamp, flicking it on. The beam cut through the gloom, creating a tunnel of light that only emphasized the suffocating darkness beyond its reach. And then he heard it. A sound that wasn't a sound. A whisper, not words, not even distinct syllables, but a rustling, a sibilant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like dry leaves being dragged across stone, or 1,000 tiny insects skittering just out of sight. It was the sound of something crawling. He spun around, beam dancing wildly. Nothing, just trees. But the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in on him from the darkness. He felt a chilling breath on the back of his neck, though there was no wind. The air around him dropped several degrees, a sudden, unnatural cold that gnawed at his bones. He started running, not a frantic sprint, but a desperate, stumbling jog through the uneven terrain, roots and rocks threatening to trip him at every step. The whisper followed, sometimes fading, sometimes surging, always just behind him, just to his left, then his right. He could hear the faint, dry thump-thump of something dragging itself through the undergrowth. Something heavy, something low to the ground. He tripped, sprawling across a thick root, his headlamp flying free, plunging him into absolute blackness. The silence returned, thicker, more terrifying than before. He lay there, heart hammering against his ribs, tasting dirt and fear. Then, a new sound. Closer this time. A rhythmic scratching, like long fingernails raking against a tree trunk. It was coming from right beside him. He scrambled backward, crawling blindly, his hand finding the headlamp. He snatched it up, flicking it on. The beam illuminated a tree trunk directly in front of him, and on it, freshly gouged into the bark, was one of those symbols, the spiral, and beneath it, a dark, viscous smear. Not sap. It smelled metallic, like blood. Samuel didn't scream. He couldn't. His throat was locked. He bolted upright, ignoring the sharp pain in his knee, and ran. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed, the terrifying whisper and the dragging thump-thump seemingly chasing him through the endless night. He crashed through bushes, stumbled over unseen logs, desperate for the barest hint of a road, a distant light, anything that signified another human being. He fell again, this time down a steep, leaf-choked embankment, landing hard at the bottom. The fall jarred him, but perhaps saved him. He lay half-conscious, the headlamp beam painting a distorted circle on the forest floor, casting long, dancing shadows. And then, in the edge of the beam, he saw it. Or rather, he saw the absence of it. A darkness deeper than the night itself, coalescing between two ancient oaks. It wasn't a shape, not truly. More like a void, an unlight that seemed to absorb the headlamp's rays. But within that void, something gleamed. 2 points of light, like tiny ancient embers, burning with a cold, malevolent intelligence. They weren't eyes, they were older, more fundamental. The whisper surrounded him now, a chorus of dry, rasping sibilants, and the dragging thump-thump was right there, just beyond the edge of his vision. He could feel the cold radiating from the void, a profound, soul-chilling cold that tightened his chest and stole his breath. He knew, with an awful certainty, that if he looked directly at it, he would cease to exist. His mind would unravel. He heard a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate his very bones, coming from the unlight. And then, a voice. Not a speak-able voice, but a thought implanted directly into his mind, devoid of language, yet utterly clear. You don't belong here. You never did. The last thing Samuel did was scramble, on hands and knees, away from that dreadful presence. away from the impossible cold and the ancient, hateful gaze. He didn't know how long he crawled, how long he ran in that waking nightmare. He doesn't remember reaching the edge of the forest, stumbling onto a deserted logging road as dawn painted, the sky a bruised purple. He just remembers the distinct, undeniable feeling that something had attached itself to him, a shadow, a resonance. Samuel is back now. He survived, but he rarely takes photographs anymore. And when he does, if you look closely in the deepest shadows of his images, you might just catch a glimpse of something that isn't quite a shadow, something that doesn't quite belong. He says the mountains whisper to him still, not words, but promises. Promises of truths he can never unseen. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, he hears a faint, dry thump-thump from the other side of the wall. He knows it's waiting, and he knows, deep down, that soon it will call him home. So tell me, when you look into the heart of the wilderness, what do you see? A beautiful escape, or something else? Something ancient and hungry, waiting for you to get lost. The Appalachian has a way of holding on to its visitors, sometimes forever. It's a living shadow that's followed me out of those mountains, clinging to every fiber of my being. You think you know fear. You think a jump scare in a dark movie theater prepares you for something that looks back at you from the deep woods, something that knows your name. Before I dive into the kind of darkness that stays with you long after the lights are on, do me a favor. If this sends a shiver down your spine, if you feel that familiar prickle of unease, hit that like button. Subscribe for more tales from the edge. And seriously, drop a comment below. Let me know if you've ever felt truly watched when you thought you were alone in the wilderness. Because after my trip into the Appalachians with Louis, I can tell you are never alone out there. It was last fall, the leaves ablaze in a final, defiant burst of color before the long sleep. Louis, my old college buddy, had convinced me. He'd found this obscure trail deep in a forgotten corner of West Virginia, promising untouched beauty, perfect for his landscape photography. We were both city-weary, craving a digital detox, a few days where the only sounds were wind and rustling leaves. We packed light, just essentials, tent, sleeping bags, enough dehydrated meals to offend a gourmet chef, and a satellite phone, just in case. Louis, ever the optimist, joked about it being overkill. Who's gonna bother us out here? Bruce, a grumpy squirrel. The first day was exactly what we'd hoped for. Crisp air, the scent of pine and damp earth, sunlight dappling through the canopy. We hiked for hours, deeper and deeper, until the sounds of civilization were just a distant hum in our memory. Louis was in his element, snapping photos of moss-covered rocks and ancient gnarled trees that looked like they'd seen centuries pass. That's when we found it, not on any map, not mentioned in any trail guide Louis had obsessed over. It was a cabin, nestled in a clearing so dense, we almost walked past it. Hand-hewn logs, blackened with age, a sagging porch, and a gaping maw where the front door should have been. It looked like it had been swallowed by the forest, and then vomited back out, forgotten. Whoa, Louis breathed, his camera already up. Talk about rustic. I had a bad feeling immediately. The air around it felt heavy, stagnant. Even the birdsong seemed to quiet down. It wasn't just old, it felt wrong. Like something had died there, and part of its essence refused to leave. Maybe we should keep moving, I suggested. my voice sounding unnaturally loud. Louis, always the adventurous one, ignored me. He peered into the darkness of the doorway. "Just a quick look, Bruce. It's too cool to pass up." He stepped inside. I hesitated, then followed, my senses on high alert. The cabin was tiny, just one room, smelling of damp earth, decay, and something else. Something metallic, like old blood, but subtle. There wasn't much inside: a collapsed cot, a rusted pot, and on the dirt floor, crude symbols etched into the packed earth. Geometric shapes, interlocking triangles, and what looked disturbingly like distorted stick figures with elongated limbs. "Creepy," Louis murmured, snapping a few shots. "Looks like some kind of weird folk art." My stomach clenched. "Let's go." "Seriously, Louis." As we turned to leave, a faint scratching sound came from the far corner. It wasn't rats. It was too rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood. We both froze. Then, silence. "Probably just settling wood," Louis said, trying to sound nonchalant, but his eyes darted nervously. We made camp a mile or so further, but the cabin had set a tone. That night, the woods felt different. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded amplified. We heard things, or thought we did. Faint whispers, just beyond the reach of comprehension, carried on the wind. Louis swore he heard a child crying miles from anywhere. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but a cold knot of dread tightened in my gut. The next morning, Louis's compass was gone. We tore through our packs, searched the tent, retraced our steps a bit. Nothing. Later. My utility knife, the one I'd explicitly put in my outer pocket, vanished. We were growing irritable, blaming each other, but a deeper fear was setting. In it wasn't just misplacement, it felt deliberate. The real horror began that night. After a day of trying to ignore the unsettling feeling, the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just wind. They were distorted, guttural sounds, like a language trying to form, but struggling with a mouth not meant for human speech. We huddled in the tent, the small flame of our lantern casting flickering shadows that danced like grotesque figures on the nylon walls. Then came the tapping dot. It started softly against the tent wall, right beside my head. Tap, 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 like a finger, or a claw testing the fabric. I froze, not daring to breathe. Louis, across from me, had his eyes wide, reflecting the lantern light like a deer caught in headlights. Tap, tap, tap. It moved, circling the tent, faster now, sometimes scraping, sometimes a heavy thud. It sounded heavy, like something enormous, trying to be stealthy. "What is that?" Louis whispered, his voice trembling. I grabbed the only thing I had, a hiking pole. "Stay quiet." Then, a low, wet gurgle came from right outside the tent flap, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. Heavy, ragged breathing, close enough to feel the vibration through the ground. And then, a voice. Not a whisper, but a raspy, unnatural hiss, barely audible, yet piercing. "Bruce, Louis." My heart nearly exploded. It had said our names. Our names. We hadn't seen another soul in days. Louis let out a choked cry, scrambling back until he hit the tent wall. The breathing outside intensified. I could almost feel a presence looming over the tent, its shadow blotting out the faint moonlight that peeked through the trees. The air grew impossibly cold. "Run," I hissed at Louis, pushing him towards the back of the tent, trying to tear open the zipper. But before I could, the gurgling voice spoke again, closer, distinct. don't leave my home. Simultaneously, a sickening, tearing sound ripped through the front of the tent. It wasn't a knife. It sounded like thick, leathery claws. Moonlight flooded in, and in the gaping tear, I saw it. It wasn't a man, not an animal. It was a silhouette, impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, defined by the moonlight filtering through the trees behind it. Its limbs seemed too long, its head too small, almost featureless. But the eyes, oh God, the eyes, two glowing embers in the darkness, fixed on us. And then it moved, a slow, jerky motion, like something reanimating after 1,000 years. Louis screamed, a primal, raw sound of pure terror. He scrambled out the back of the tent, blindly crashing through the undergrowth. I followed, adrenaline pumping, my mind screaming, "Run, run, run." We ran through the pitch-black woods, not caring about direction, only distance. Branches whipped at us, roots tripped us. The woods were no longer a sanctuary, but a maze designed to trap us. Behind us, we heard it, a slithering, shuffling sound, unbelievably fast, punctuated by that guttural breathing. Sometimes a chilling, echoing tap, tap, tap. We ran until our lungs burned, until our legs screamed in protest. We ran until the first hint of sickly grey dawn lightened the sky, and we found ourselves, inexplicably, back at the clearing, back at the cabin. It stood there, silent, mocking, its dark doorway like an open maw. And then Louis collapsed, not from exhaustion, but something else. He was staring at the cabin, a vacant, horrified look in his eyes. He started muttering, incoherently at first. Then I caught a distinct phrase, it wants us to stay. I tried to pull him up, but he was like dead weight, his eyes locked on the cabin. As I tugged, I saw something move in the deep shadow of the doorway. It wasn't the tall, gaunt figure. It was something smaller, faster, darting back into the darkness. A flash of movement, something pale, perhaps a childlike shape. That was the last clear thing I remember. The next thing I truly recall is waking up in a hospital bed, sunlight streaming through a window. A doctor explaining something about severe dehydration and exposure. They said a park ranger found me, hallucinating and incoherent, miles from any marked trail. They asked about Louis. I told them we were together. They said they found me alone. They searched, they sent out teams. They never found Louis. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear it. A faint tap, 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 and a whisper just on the edge of hearing, calling my name. I've seen the Appalachian Mountains on postcards since, and they look beautiful, serene. But I know what truly lurks in their depths, what waits for those who wander too far, what calls those ancient, forgotten places home. And part of me wonders, was Louis ever really found? Or is he still there, with it, in its home, waiting for me to return? Can you hear it? That low, guttural murmur echoing through the valleys? Or is it just the wind whispering secrets through ancient pines? The Appalachian Mountains, they call to you, don't they? A rugged, beautiful wilderness, steeped in history, cloaked in mist, and sometimes in something far more sinister. Tonight, I'm not just telling you a story. I'm inviting you in. I'm asking you to step with me into the crushing silence, the unseen shadows, and the bone-deep terror of a place that doesn't want you there. A place where Sebastian and Eleanor learned the hard way, that some spirits cling to the land, and they don't appreciate trespasseres. Before we descend into the darkness, if this kind of raw, spine-chilling horror truly grips you, then show us. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next descent into the unknown. And most importantly, as you listen, let me know in the comments below, what would you do when the forest itself turns against you? Sebastian, ever the pragmatist, had rolled his eyes when Eleanor first suggested a digital detox in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. But her infectious enthusiasm, coupled with the allure of untouched beauty, had won him over. They were a couple who thrived on adventure, and what better way to reconnect than by shedding the modern world and embracing the ancient embrace of the mountains. Their chosen route was a section of the Appalachian Trail known for its isolation, supposedly offering unparalleled views and a tranquility that bordered on the spiritual. With sturdy boots, well-packed bags, and a compass for good measure, their phones were strictly for emergencies. Tucked away, they set off. The first day was glorious. Sun-dappled paths, the scent of pine and damp earth, the symphony of birdsong. Eleanor, with her intuitive spirit, remarked on the deep quiet of the woods, a silence that felt less like an absence of noise and more like a held breath. Sebastian, pragmatic as ever, just nodded, enjoying the calm. Their first campsite was nestled beside a babbling brook, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. As twilight deepened, however, that deep quiet returned. The birdsong faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Not even crickets chirped. Eleanor shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's too quiet," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the air. Sebastian chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably just the wildlife heading to bed. You're overthinking it, babe." But then, a sound. A low, rhythmic thumping, distant at first, barely discernible beneath the gurgle of the brook. It wasn't the steady beat of a human drum, nor the irregular patter of an animal. It was organic, yet deliberate. Thump, thump. Eleanor's eyes darted towards the dense tree line. "What is that?" Sebastian listened, his brow furrowed. "Beats me. Could be anything. An old pump, some late-night logger." He tried to sound convincing, even to himself, but deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. The sound continued until they finally drifted off. A strange lullaby accompanying their dreams. The next morning, the air was thicker, mist clinging to the ancient trees like spectral lace. Their GPS, which had been spotty, now refused to connect at all. The compass needle spun erratically for a moment before settling on an odd bearing. "Must be some magnetic anomaly," Sebastian muttered, trying to sound confident. They decided to follow an old, faded trail marker Eleanor spotted, a path less traveled that promised a shortcut to an overlook. Almost immediately, the woods grew denser, the familiar path dissolving into a labyrinth of gnarled roots and Moscovite stones. The air grew heavy, cloying. There was a smell now, to damp earth mingled with something else, something rotten but not quite animal, a decay that felt ancient and wrong. Then came the whispers. You'd swear it was just the wind, rustling through the leaves, but wasn't there a cadence to it? A faint, sibilant murmur, just at the edge of hearing, like wind trying to form words. "Sis, come closer," your stomach clenches. Do you tell your partner what you heard, or pretend it's nothing to avoid panic? Eleanor, ever the more attuned, paused. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice hushed. Sebastian, who had heard it, shook his head. "Just the wind, honey. Let's keep moving. He pushed forward, trying to outrun the growing dread. But the forest pressed in. Fleeting shadows danced in their peripheral vision, impossible movements between the closely packed trees that vanished the moment they turned their heads. Sebastian started to feel it, the oppressive weight, the feeling of being watched. Studied, night fell again, bringing with it a chill that seeped into their bones. They set up camp in a clearing that felt less welcoming, more exposed. The rhythmic thumping was closer now, louder, and with it, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. Thump drag, the whispers, no longer at the edge of hearing, were clearer, yet still unintelligible. Circling their tent, Eleanor huddled against Sebastian, trembling. Something is out there, Seb. I can feel it. It's watching us. Sebastian pulled her tighter, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to reassure her, but the words felt hollow. Then, a branch snapped. Not wind, not an animal. Something large, right outside their tent. The breath catches in your throat. Do you make a sound? Do you reach for a weapon, or freeze, hoping? It passes. They froze, not daring to breathe. Then, a sound that transcended all others. A deep, resonant hum began, vibrating through the ground, through their very bones. It seemed to come from all directions, an omnipresent, chilling resonance. Through the thin fabric of their tent, twin points of dull, yellowish light appeared, eyes just outside. Watching panic, cold and sharp, lacerated Sebastian's fleeting. Control, we need to go, he whispered, his voice raw. They scrambled, abandoning most of their gear, tearing down the tent in fumbling terror. They just needed to run. They ran blindly through the pre-dawn darkness, the forest a distorted maze of shadows and impossible shapes. The thumping dragging grew faster, closer, a relentless pursuit. The hum was a constant, oppressive presence, pressing down on them, stealing the oxygen from their lungs. Stumbling, they burst into a small, overgrown clearing. In its center stood a decrepit, leaning cabin, its windows like vacant eyesores. A last resort, a trap. They didn't have a choice. Bursting through the rotting door, they slammed it shut behind them, collapsing against the flimsy wood. Inside, the cabin was a tomb. The air was colder, heavier. The walls were covered in strange, crudely drawn symbols, primal, disturbing glyphs that spoke of ancient, forgotten things. Images that seemed to writhe in the dimness. A sudden, shriek ripped through the air outside, so loud, so full of pure, predatory rage, it made their ears ring. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was something else. Then, a massive impact against the cabin wall, shaking the entire structure, sending dust and splinters raining down. This thing was powerful. They scrambled, hiding behind a collapsed table, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The thumping, dragging sound was inside the cabin now, coming from the next room. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. Panic floods you. Do you risk looking, or do you try to find another way out? Eleanor, frozen in terror, risked a glance. Through the gap in the doorway, she saw it. A tall, impossibly gaunt figure, made of shadows and twisted limbs, its body seeming to ripple and contort with each unnatural movement. Its head was indistinct, but those two dull, glowing eyes stared directly into the darkness where they hid. It moved with a slow, dragging gait, as if burdened by immense weight, or perhaps by the very earth itself. Sebastian, feeling Eleanor's shudder, saw the terror in her eyes as she pointed to a boarded-up window in the back room. With a surge of desperate adrenaline, he tore at the rotting wood, kicking through the decaying frame. They scrambled through, scratching themselves on jagged glass and splintered wood, bursting back into the cold pre-dawn air. They ran. They didn't know where, just away, downhill, blindly, limbs aching, lungs burning, until they finally stumbled out onto a narrow dirt road, just as the first sliver of sunrise painted the sky gold. The sounds faded behind them as they descended. Leaving the malevolent woods behind, they eventually flagged down a passing logger. Looking like wild animals, scratched, disoriented, their eyes wide with unspeakable horror, they tried to explain, but the words failed them. How do you describe a thing of shadows and hums to a man who only sees trees? He just gave them a long, pitying look and drove them to the nearest town. Weeks later, back in their quiet apartment, safe from the mountains, they were anything but. Eleanor was jumpy, hearing things in the mundane sounds of the city. Sebastian was withdrawn, haunted, his once rational mind now a battleground for the impossible. They avoided eye contact, knowing the unspeakable shared memory that lay between them. They thought they had escaped. One night, the silence in their apartment was suddenly too loud. Eleanor sat bolt upright in bed, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice a thin thread of fear. Sebastian, who had been staring at the ceiling for hours, sat up too, his face pale. His eyes, once so practical, were now pools of bottomless dread. The hum, he breathed, the sound barely audible. It's back. You probably think you've seen it all, heard every spooky tale under the sun. Ghost stories, creepypastas, urban legends. They're a dime a dozen, right? But I'm going to tell you something different. This isn't just a campfire tale, and it's certainly not fiction. This is what happened to Henry, and if you've ever felt that cold, primal dread, that whisper on the back of your neck when you're utterly alone in the wilderness, then you're going to understand, because the Appalachians, they don't just have secrets. They are secrets, ancient and hungry, so lean in close, kill the lights, if you dare. Because what I'm about to share, it's going to crawl under your skin and stay there. Henry wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't looking for Bigfoot or skinwalkers. He was just a city guy, tired of the concrete jungle, chasing some peace. He packed his trusty backpack, a cheap tent, and enough dehydrated food to last a week. His destination? A remote, rarely trekked section of the Appalachian Trail, far from any established campsites or cell towers. He wanted solitude. He found something else entirely. The first day was textbook perfect. Crisp autumn air leaves a riot of fiery reds and burnt oranges, the only sounds the rustle of squirrels and the crunch of his boots on fallen foliage. He found a secluded clearing by a trickling stream, set up camp, and cooked a quick meal. The sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, and then the darkness descended. Not the soft, ambient glow of city nights, but an absolute, suffocating black that pressed in from all sides. You could almost feel its weight. He crawled into his tent, the zipper a surprisingly loud rip in the sudden silence. That's when it started. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of waiting. You know that feeling, right? When you're alone in a big, empty house, and you swear you're not alone. Amplify that by 1,000, plunge it into the heart of a primal forest. He heard whispers, faint, indistinct, like wind through dry leaves, but too rhythmic, too conversational. They weren't coming from any particular direction. They seemed to float inside the tent, just beyond the thin nylon shell. Henry, a man of science and logic, rationalized it away. Wind animals, his own tired mind playing tricks. He pulled his sleeping bag tighter and tried to sleep, but then came the clicking. A steady, soft clack, 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 like two small stones being tapped together just outside his tent flap. It wasn't a cricket. It wasn't natural. The rhythm was too deliberate, too inquisitive. He held his breath, straining to hear over his own pounding heart. The clicking stopped, replaced by something far worse. A sound, not quite a voice, not quite an animal call. It was a perfect mimicry of a child's giggle, high-pitched, innocent, but utterly out of place. And it came from about 10 feet away, just beyond the tent. You'd dismiss it, wouldn't you? Say it was a fox, or some bird. Henry did too, at first, but the giggle was followed by a sob. A soft, mournful sob. And then a whisper, clear as day, right outside his tent. "Mama." Henry froze. Every instinct screamed at him to stay still, to not make a sound, to not acknowledge it. He lay there, paralyzed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. He waited and waited. Eventually, exhaustion won, and he must have drifted off into a restless half-sleep, the child's mournful whisper echoing in his subconscious. If you're feeling that familiar shiver right now, that little prickle of fear, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you're enjoying this ride into the dark, please hit that like button, subscribe for more nightmares, and tell me in the comments, what's the creepiest sound you've ever heard in the dead of night? Your stories help me know I'm not alone in this fascination. The next morning, Henry emerged from his tent, pale and unrested. The forest, bathed in sunlight, looked beautiful again. It was hard to believe the terror of the night before. He convinced himself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the isolated darkness. He packed up quickly, eager to put distance between himself and that particular spot. He spent the morning hiking, trying to outrun the lingering dread. The trail, however, seemed to betray him. Despite following his map and compass, the landmarks didn't quite match. Trees he remembered passing seemed to reappear. The path began to narrow, eventually disappearing altogether, replaced by dense thickets of rhododendron and gnarled, ancient trees whose branches looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The sunlight, once bright, now seemed to struggle to penetrate the oppressive canopy. He was lost, deeply, irrevocably lost. He checked his phone, no signal, of course. Battery at 5%. Panic, cold and sharp, began to truly set in. He decided to find a high point, try to get his bearings. He scrambled up a steep incline, branches tearing at his clothes, his breath ragged. When he reached what he hoped was a ridge, he stopped, and then he heard it again. Not the giggle this time, not the sob. It was his own voice. "Henry, you out there, buddy?" Loud, clear, like he was standing right behind him. But it was his voice, the exact timbre, the slight hesitation before buddy. Henry spun around, heart rocketing against his ribs. Nothing, just the endless, tangled forest. "Henry, where are you going?" the voice cooed, drawing out the vowel, still perfectly mimicking him. But this time there was a subtle, unholy inflection, a slight elongation of the Y that made it sound less like a friend and more like something Playing with him, he ran. He didn't know where he was going, just away. He plunged down the slope, stumbling, falling, scraping his knees and hands. He heard the footsteps then, not human footsteps. Heavy, dragging, but impossibly fast. The sound was always just a few feet behind him, sometimes seeming to circle him, as if something was delighting in its hunt. The air grew colder, even though the sun was still high. A smell like wet earth and something anciently dead filled his nostrils. He burst through a curtain of thorny vines and found himself in a small, unnatural clearing. In the center stood a single, enormous stone, covered in crude, almost prehistoric carvings, swirling lines, stick figures with elongated limbs, and, most chillingly, a series of eyes. Dozens of them, carved into the rock, all staring, all slightly different, but all holding the same vacant, malevolent gaze. And then, from behind the stone, he heard the clicking. The same clack 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 from the night before, only louder, closer, echoing off the stone. And then, the voice, no longer mimicking, but a guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. A language he couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. "You are ours." Henry didn't hesitate. He ran again, blind with terror, not caring where. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs screamed, until the oppressive darkness of the trees finally began to thin, giving way to sparser woods, then fields, then, miraculously, the distant glint of a paved road. He stumbled onto the asphalt, covered in mud, blood, and leaves, gasping for air, collapsing onto the roadside. A passing car, a beat-up pickup truck, screeched to a halt. The old man behind the wheel, a local, peered at him with a mixture of shock and something else. "Recognition, son," the man said, his voice slow and gravelly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Henry could only shake his head, trembling. He couldn't speak. He still couldn't speak, not truly, about what he'd endured. Henry's back now, or what's left of him. He doesn't go outside much anymore. He says the trees whisper his name, even here in the city. He keeps the curtains drawn, says the shadows stretch too long to grasping. He lost nearly 30 pounds in that week. But he swears the Appalachian air tasted like a feast to whatever was out there. He has a recurring nightmare, he told me once. He's back in his tent, and the clack 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 is outside. But this time, when the child's giggle comes, and the soft, pleading mama, he hears his own mother's voice answer from just outside the tent flap. "Yes, darling, Mama's here." And then he hears the slow, dragging footsteps getting closer, closer, until something brushes against the tent wall, and a low, satisfied chuckle, his own chuckle, fills the air, and he wakes up every single time. He never went back to the mountains, but sometimes, when the wind blows just right, and the leaves outside my window rustle in a particular way, I swear I hear it too. That faint, deliberate clack dash clack dash clack dotch, and I wonder, how did Henry's story get to me? And why do I feel like I'm not just telling it, but passing it on? Sleep tight, folks. Just don't listen too closely to the sounds that aren't really there. Or are they? I am standing on the edge of a deep ridge in the Appalachian Mountains. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, clings to your skin. Above, the canopy is so dense, it feels less like a sky and more like the roof of a colossal, sprawling crypt. The silence isn't peaceful. It's a heavy, suffocating blanket, broken only by the frantic thump of your own heart. Because you know, deep down, something ancient lives here. Something that preys not just on the body, but on the very fabric of your sanity. If you've ever felt that primal fear, that whisper of the truly unknown, hit that like button right now. Share this story, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what's your most terrifying wilderness experience? Because what Lucas and Chloe went through out here, it's the kind of nightmare that carves itself into your soul. Lucas, a man whose easy grin usually masked a restless spirit, had always been drawn to the wild. Chloe, with her sharp wit and even sharper eye for detail, was his perfect counterpart, always ready for an adventure. They weren't your average thrill seekers. They sought solitude, the raw beauty of untamed nature. And so, the Appalachian Trail, specifically a remote, lesser-known section tucked deep within its heart, seemed like the ideal escape. They set off in late autumn, the leaves a riot of fire and rust, each crunch underfoot echoing in the otherwise profound stillness. For the first 2 days, it was crisp mornings, challenging climbs that rewarded them with breathtaking vistas, nights spent under a blanket of stars so impossibly bright, they felt like glittering dust scattered across velvet. But then, on the 3rd day, the air shifted. The light seemed to dim, even at midday, filtered through a permanent, low-hanging mist that clung to the ancient trees. The whispers started subtly. The wind, they told themselves. Just the wind, playing tricks among the branches. You've been in places like this, haven't you, where the natural sounds start to feel? Wrong, Lucas, ever the pragmatist, brushed off the growing unease. Just the mountain air makes everything feel a bit primordial. Chloe, however, was less convinced. Her usually keen senses were on edge. The familiar calls of birds grew strangely silent. The forest floor, once alive with scampering squirrels and rustling leaves, became eerily still. And the trees, they seemed to press in closer, their gnarled limbs twisting into grotesque, watchful shapes. They were heading towards what their outdated map cautiously labeled Whispering Hollow, a local name dismissed by guidebooks as mere folklore, but irresistible to Lucas. The path grew fainter, finally disappearing altogether. They found themselves pushing through dense undergrowth, the air growing heavier, colder, despite their exertion. "Are we sure this is the way?" Chloe asked, her voice a little too quiet. The mist had thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet. It felt like walking through a damp shroud. Lucas pulled out his GPS, but the signal was sporadic, jumping wildly. "Must be the tree cover," he muttered, though a flicker of worry crossed his face. Then they heard it. A faint, low hum, almost imperceptible, rising from somewhere deep within the mist. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't natural. It was a sound that vibrated not in their ears, but in their bones. Can you hear it? That low thrum that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. What do? Do you press on, driven by curiosity, or do you turn back, giving in to the gnawing fear? They pressed on. What choice did they have? Turning back meant admitting defeat, admitting they were lost. The hum grew a resonant, almost hypnotic drone. It seemed to come from all directions at once, disorienting them further. Suddenly, Chloe stopped dead. "Lucas, look." Through a momentary thinning of the mist, they saw it. Not a cabin, not a shack, but a crude, totemic structure, woven from branches, human hair, and what looked disturbingly like bone. It stood about 7 feet tall, its top adorned with what appeared to be a mummified bird. Around its base, small stones were arranged in a disturbing spiral, each one stained with a dark reddish-brown hue. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the trees behind them. They spun around, but saw nothing. Just the swirling mist and the looming, silent shapes of ancient oaks. "We need to get out of here," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. Lucas nodded, his face pale. The hum intensified, now accompanied by something new, a faint, almost melodic wail, like a human lament carried on the wind, but distorted, inhuman. It seemed to coil around them, wrapping them in a chilling embrace. They stumbled away from the totem, pushing through the thorny bushes, the wail growing louder, closer. They started to run, their heavy packs banging against their backs, their breathing ragged. The forest seemed to actively resist them, branches clawing at their clothes, roots tripping their feet. Then Lucas fell. He cried out, not in pain, but in sheer terror. His foot had caught on something beneath a pile of rotting leaves. He scrambled back, staring wide-eyed at what he'd uncovered. It was a shallow grave, barely covered, and protruding from the earth. Pale and skeletal was a human hand. Your blood runs cold. You see it, that fragile, stark white hand reaching from the earth. Do you scream? Do you freeze? Or do you find some reserves of courage you didn't know you had, before they could even process the horror? The wail crescendoed into a piercing shriek that tore through the mist, so close it felt like it was inside their heads. The air grew icy cold, and the very ground beneath them seemed to hum with malevolent energy. A shadow detached itself from the trees, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. They didn't see features, just a gaping void where a face should be, and long, claw-like appendages. It was a movement of pure wrongness, an ancient evil disturbed. Run. Lucas roared, grabbing Chloe's hand. They ran blindly, adrenaline their only guide. The forest was a labyrinth, the mist a blinding shroud. The creature, whatever it was behind them, its unnatural movements surprisingly swift. They could hear the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, impossibly close. Its wail echoed, a symphony of pure, unadulterated terror. They scrambled down a steep incline, tripping and falling, momentum carrying them forward. Chloe cried out as a branch scraped her arm, leaving a raw, bleeding gash. They tumbled into a muddy hollow, landing hard. Above them, the wailing stopped. A heavy silence descended, broken only by their ragged gasps. They lay still, barely breathing, listening. Nothing, no wail, no rustle. Just the persistent, low hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground. Then, a voice. It wasn't the wail. It was a whisper, a guttural, raspy sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It spoke in a language they didn't understand, yet its meaning was terrifyingly clear. You are ours now, driven by an instinct beyond reason. Lucas spotted a faint glimmer through the tree's water. A stream, maybe, a way out. He dragged Chloe up, ignoring their aching muscles, their torn clothes. They plunged into the icy stream, the cold a shock that momentarily cleared their minds. The water swirled around their knees, strong and fast. They pushed against the current, following its path, hoping it led to a wider river. To civilization. The oppressive mist began to thin, slowly, imperceptibly. The faint light of dawn, or perhaps just a break in the cloud cover, began to filter through the canopy. The unnerving hum began to fade, receding like a tide. They didn't look back. They just kept moving, one shivering, waterlogged foot in front of the other. Hours later, broken and disoriented, they stumbled onto a paved road. It was just a narrow, rarely used logging road, but it was salvation. A passing truck, its driver startled by their wild appearance, eventually picked them up, taking them to the nearest town. They told their story, haltingly, to the bewildered sheriff, to concerned locals. They talked about getting lost, about strange sounds, about the mist, about the fear. But they couldn't bring themselves to speak of the totem, of the hand, of the shadow that stalked them. They knew, instinctively, that some horrors were too personal, too profound, to be truly believed. They returned home, but the Appalachians had left their mark. Lucas, once so jovial, now carried a permanent shadow in his eyes. He rarely smiled, and the slightest rustle of leaves outside their window would make him jump. Chloe, always so composed, found herself staring blankly into space, haunted by the memory of that ancient hum, that inhuman wail. They never went back to the mountains. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, when the moon is hidden behind a shroud of cloud, they hear it. A faint, low hum, resonating from deep within the earth. A sound that promises that something is still out there, waiting. And occasionally, in the deepest quiet of the night, a single, raspy whisper seems to echo in the dark. You are ours now. It's a warning, isn't it? A reminder that some places are not meant for human exploration, that some ancient things are better left undisturbed. They escaped, yes, but did they ever truly leave the Appalachians behind? Or did the mountain, in its quiet, terrifying way, go home with them? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt that lingering presence? That cold shadow that follows you even after you've left a place? Let's talk about it.